Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 40th round of the Cairo Climate Talks. Tonight, we're going to be talking about putting the Paris Agreement into effect, climate change action in Africa. Thank you very much for joining us. You're all aware that the Paris Agreement, which is the outcome of 2 intense weeks of negotiations, has set up a clear ambition to limit global temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Since April, and following the invitation of the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, 177 parties have signed the agreement that defines clear objectives to limit emissions and tread on an increasingly sustainable path. So far, 46 African countries have signed the Paris Agreement and have pledged to reduce their emissions. But the case of the African continent is quite exceptional. While the entire continent is only responsible for 4% of global emissions, it will be one of the most affected by climate change. Indeed, it is already being affected by unprecedented heat waves, sea level rise, extreme weather events, desertification, and poor agricultural output, all caused by global warming. Some projections have established that climate change could cost the African continent $40 billion a year, which is equivalent to 2.7% of the continent's GDP. But Africa is also home to enormous renewable energy resources. And since energy production is responsible for about 60% of all the emissions in the world, Africa could be at the forefront of the battle of climate change, provided the right enabling and implementing mechanisms are put in place. I just want us to quickly look at some numbers, at some figures. The continent can source an additional 10 terawatt of solar energy, 1,300 gigawatt of wind power, 350 gigawatt of hydroelectricity, and 15 gigawatt of geothermal energy. In addition, Africa is home to 1/5 of the planet's tropical forest, considered the most efficient atmospheric vacuum cleaners. They can basically store up to 1.2 billion tons of carbon a year. But many challenges remain to tap into this potential, and many barriers will need to be removed. So before turning to our panelists, who will give us a clear view of where Africa stands in terms of climate action right now, I would like to call the German ambassador, Julius Jörg Loy, to give us his opening remarks. Mr. Ambassador.
No, thank you very much. It's very kind to introduce me. And just wanted to warn, there's a pre-Ramadan urge of events now. I have to leave shortly after my own presentation. So don't take it as a protest. Don't take it as a lack of interest. I'm very interested in this issue, but I simply have to continue from here. Dr. Sibylle Röhrkasten, Mrs. Lena Donat, Mrs. Mariam Alan, and Mr. Mohamed Khalil. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Cairo Climate Talks. Nature will talk to us, once concluded climate expert Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, and I remember having cited this already. Taking into account the already visible consequences of global warming and the cataclysms increasing in quantity and intensity worldwide, I had updated him saying, nature is already yelling at us. I'm sure that some of you have attended our Cairo Climate Talks event in April 2015, igniting a hot and quite controversial discussion about the form and the contents of the Paris Agreement. Back then, we were not quite sure whether the community of states will be able to reach a universal and binding agreement in Paris in December 2015 or not. And I remember having discussed this question even a few weeks before with the Minister for Environment here. Now we know better. I'm delighted and relieved that after intense negotiations, we now have such an agreement which paves the way for a sustainable global future by reducing CO2 emissions and limiting the rise of global temperature to, as it states in the agreement, well below 2 degrees Celsius. Only some weeks ago, the agreement was signed, among other, by the Egyptian Minister of Environment and Barbara Hendricks, the German Minister of Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear Safety. And I am convinced that this agreement, and more importantly, the implementation of what states agreed upon, is the right answer to the yelling of our nature. Tonight, we will discuss what the Paris Agreement actually and practically means for Germany and the European Union, for Egypt and for Africa. The European Union committed itself to cut emissions by 40% until 2030. Also, Egypt presented its intended nationally determined contribution, its INDC, which will be supported by us as part of our long-standing and intensive cooperation in the field of environment, climate and energy. However, no matter how ambitious our goals are, the substantial support of the private sector, as well as the awareness and the commitment of the broad public, is essential when it comes to reaching these goals. On the other hand, the consequences of a potential failure of the international community to reach the well below 2 degrees Celsius goal will be severe, yet unevenly distributed. Egypt will be among those countries most severely hit by climate change and global warming. Rising sea levels, desertification, and water scarcity are only some of the dangers brought about by an increasing average temperature, and described for Africa by you very illustratively. Moreover, climate change has become a crucial challenge in international politics, a challenge for peace and stability, and is therefore no longer limited to the sphere of environment, but a highly political issue. Scarce resources, a reduction of arable land, uninhabitable areas, and fewer sources of income might destabilize states or cause tensions between neighboring states. Thus, a preventive security policy needs to take into account climate policy. However, let's not be pessimistic, and let's also look at the opportunities the Paris Agreement offers. An important initiative launched in Paris is the African Renewable Energy Initiative. What is the potential of clean energy on the African continent? How can civil society be engaged in climate change action? What are the needs of the African continent in terms of adaptation and of mitigation? How can we work together to reduce emissions on a global scale? Ladies and gentlemen, this forum is one opportunity to bring these important questions to the public, to engage in discussion with Egyptian, African and German experts, civil society representatives, private sector and academia. Please use it. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
So before I call our panelists to the stage, I just want to point your attention to the sticky note that you were given. So the idea of this is to basically write down questions if you have any, and like in a little while, one of my colleagues will come around and collect them so we can ask them to our panelists at the end of the discussion. Okay, so without further ado, I will now introduce each panelist and call them up to the stage one by one. Dr. Sibylle Rohrkasten, please. She is the coordinator of the Global Energy Transition at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. In her research, she focuses on international policy and governance to expand the worldwide deployment of renewable energy. She recently co-authored the report entitled The Future of Africa's Energy Supply, which suggests policy solutions for achieving the objectives supported by the G7 declaration. In a nutshell, this declaration pledged to accelerate access to renewable energy in Africa and in other regions, to reduce energy poverty, and to mobilize substantial financial resources from private investors, development finance institutions, and multilateral development banks by 2020. I will now call Mr. Mohamed Khalil to the stage. He is the head of the Environment and Sustainable Development Affairs at the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has 20 years of experience in the field of diplomacy across different areas, including international politics, international economic affairs, sustainable development, and environment. Mr. Khalil was one of the main negotiators of the Group of 77 in China, and he was particularly he worked particularly during the negotiations in Rio 20, establishing the high-level political forum and the technology facilitation mechanism. He was also an active member of the UN General Assembly's Open Working Group and helped develop the Sustainable Development Goals. He is an active member of the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change and has participated in all UNFCCC negotiations since 2011. Now, I will call Ms. Lena Donat to the stage. She's a fellow at the Ecologic Institute and a member of the Ecologic legal team in Berlin. She specializes in international environmental law with a particular focus on climate change. She's involved in international negotiations on climate change and provides legal analysis and advice to the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Natural Conservation and Nuclear Safety. She's also active on a number of projects related to climate change mitigation. Among those, she's developing the evaluation criteria for international climate policy scenarios, as well as a knowledge platform which will make knowledge on the impact of climate policy more easily accessible. And last but not least, I would like to introduce and call to the stage Ms. Mariam Alem, who is a climate activist from Egypt, who's been following the UN climate negotiations for the past 5 years. She is the national coordinator of the Arab Youth Climate Movement, an initiative that is now present across 17 countries in the region. She's also the focal person of the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change in Egypt. And this is an initiative that brings together a multitude of young climate experts from Africa. So as you can see, we have a very unbalanced gender panel, which I believe deserves a warm round of applause. So I'm going to start with the only man on this panel, Mr. Khalil. Just a decade ago at COP11 in Montreal, African negotiators had no common position and no common voice to defend the interests of the continent. Since then, there has been a lot of improvements in that regard. And last year in Paris, Africa had a conference of African heads of states on climate change, an expert team of about 200 climate negotiators, and a clearly outlined position on the negotiations. How can this unified front help the continent in its fight against climate change?
First of all, I would like to say to all the audience, good evening, and it's a pleasure for me to be here among these distinguished panelists with the unbalanced gender effect as well. And as well, it's a pleasure for me to join the Cairo Climate Talk for the first time. I couldn't make it the previous times because I was involved in negotiations at the same time, so I made it this time. So this is as well, it's a source of pleasure for me. Now getting to your question, it's true that the African group of negotiators evolved over the years, and I think the turning point was really in 2009. It's when the group got kind of well-structured and well-framed framework for working. As you know, the structure of African engagement in climate change, it's what we call the three-tier structure because it has 3 levels. There is the presidential level or the summit level, which is the level of CAOSC. This is the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. And currently it's headed or coordinated by His Excellency, the President of the Republic, the President of Egypt. And then there is the ministerial level, which is the Conference of African Ministers of Environment, or it's called AMSEN. And the third layer is the negotiators layer, which is the African group of negotiators. It's true that at the beginning, the kickoff was quite challenging, but it's true that over the years, the group managed to come together and to maintain the unity of Africa so that Africa can speak with one voice. And this is something that all African summits stress on and underline. And I have to say that it has a price as well. It's not for free, that all countries need to reach out to each other and to compromise so that we can have a common position. This is definitely helping Africa achieving its objectives, because I believe this is the only region that is organized in this manner. And definitely the voice of 54 countries united together, it's different than if the case it's about scattered countries. And this, of course, gives weight to the negotiating positions of the group. And I think in Paris, it was a clear reflection of that, because many of the issues that the African group was advocating for have been reflected in Paris. To give examples, the 1.5 degrees, this has been a long-standing request for the African group, and as well as a global goal on adaptation, and raising the profile of adaptation and dealing with it as international responsibility. This as well has been an important issue for African group of negotiators.
I think I will turn to Ms. Lena Donat just to have a bit...
on the same topic?
Well, it's related, yes. I would like to know, since you specialize on environmental law and you've been following the negotiations really closely, what do you think have been the big wins for Africa, like in terms of outcome of the Paris Agreement, and which are the remaining contentious points?
Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me in, for being here, that I can be here. It's a great pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to interesting discussions later on with the audience as well. On your question, the big wins for Africa, of course, it's my outsider perspective that I will bring here, and maybe Mr. Khalid can join on some other comments as well. Well, first of all, I think the biggest win is that we do have an agreement. And this is a win for all countries, including for Africa. Africa will be the continent that will be most severely hit by climate change impact. So anything that stops or at least slows down climate change has very positive impact and is a win for Africa. And the Paris Agreement does that, or I believe it will at least. It's not yet enforced, and we need the ratification by all countries. But at least in the run-up to Paris, almost all countries have presented their national climate plans. And these climate plans, if they are implemented, bring us from a 4-degree world to a 3-degree world, which is already a big step forward. But not yet enough, because we need at least 2 or 1.5 degree to move us in a safe space. So I think on the mitigation side, this is like a really important win. That we have these climate plans, and that we also have a mechanism in the Paris Agreement to regularly increase these climate plans, to every 5 years check on them again whether we can increase the ambition, and to check whether the overall level will take us maybe much closer to 2 degrees. On the second point, I think on the adaptation side, which is of course a very important topic for Africa, we have in the Paris Agreement a global goal on adaptation, and adaptation features prominently in the agreement, and that was a big win for many developing countries because they fought very hardly for having adaptation as a topic recognized in the agreement. Of course, the parts of the Paris Agreement that deal with adaptation are more vaguely phrased, because adaptation is very country specific and it's very difficult to find common rules that need to apply to everyone. But it's a topic that features prominently, and there's also recognition that more finance needs to flow into adaptation. So I think this is also a win. And thirdly, I think the overall political momentum that was gained around the Paris Climate Summit will have positive impacts for Africa as well. Because there were so many initiatives that were started in the surroundings of the COP in Paris, like initiatives on renewable energy, initiatives on shifting investments to more sustainable pathways, and many cities pledged to shift to renewable energies. There were so many actors that actually got involved, and I think if we manage to keep this political momentum up, then it will have very positive impacts as well for Africa.
And the fact that you're saying that adaptation was featured heavily in the text and in the negotiation is really important, specifically, I guess, for Africa, since it emits so little emissions, and most of the work will have to be done on the side of adaptation.
Exactly.
Mariam, actually, I wanted to react to what has been said about the intended national contributions. They were calculated and aggregated together during the COP21 to also, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with INDCs, but each country was invited to give out its plan on how to reduce emissions. What happened is, instead of reaching the 2-degree mark that we were looking for, we after aggregation, we were somewhere between 2.7 and 3.5 degrees. So what can civil society across Africa do to make sure decision makers limit global warming to 2 degrees and even ratchet up their ambitions?
All right, so thank you. Again, I'm here. I'm happy that I was here pre-COP and now we are post-COP, so now there's progress. I need not repeat all that's been said about success in reaching an agreement and what Africa is actually taking home from the Paris Agreement. But let me add, for the wins, even for civil society, away from the Article number 7, the global goal on adaptation, and there's also what we call the Paris Committee on capacity building, which is really great for us. The African group has been pushing for this, along with, it was actually backed by the civil society. The whole African group, along with the least developed countries and all the climate vulnerables, they've been together pushing for this, pushing for a well below 2-degree rise and reaching to 1.5, which is a great success. Piling up the current INDCs actually projects to somewhere between, it's actually more, it reached up to 3.7, not just 3.5, which is very unfair. The success is, for the first time in the Paris Agreement, we are finally breaking the developing and sort of overcoming the historical responsibility a little bit. We now have a mechanism where it's a bottom-up approach, where all the countries get to submit their INDCs or NDCs, nationally determined contributions. They say, we can do this. However, for African countries and developing nations, we might not have all what it takes, like our respective capability might be a little bit below when it comes to implementation, finance, technology, and capacity building. But here we go. We have pushed for a committee on capacity building, which will do a huge change. How? That's because the mechanism of the nationally determined contributions includes an every 5-year review. That's one thing. And it's actually where all the countries get to sit together on the same table every 5 years. It's a 5-year cycle review where we get together to sit on the table. And it has to have progression, like we have to go forwards, we cannot go back. And it has to be more ambitious. And in that sense comes in accountability. How and why and how that's good for the African continent, because those who did not do action or like the inaction of some countries might be because of one of two things. One thing is because they don't want to do action, which will be revealed, and the second is because they lack capacity. And here comes a point. For us as civil society, backing the negotiators on some issues, we want to be pushing for, let me recall, there is this, I don't recall its name. Yes, the capacity building actually one. We really push that it goes under the GCF. In its in the mechanism how it's going, we really want it to be under the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, because when we usually speak about the flow of finance, we are now pushing that it goes under it, because the Green Climate Fund is, let's say that it's the body where all the finance comes in. There is a pledge that there should be $1 billion US coming from developed countries, and whoever is willing to put finance for developing nations to put them in. So now we are fighting for this. We're also pushing for clear means of implementation on the provision of finance, on capacity building, on means of implementation. What else are we pushing for? Actually now, as civil society, trying to provide whatever we can towards a low carbon development pathway. To give an example, in Egypt, a couple of civil society organizations have actually produced a very rich report on 7 alternative energy scenarios in Egypt. And the good point is that there are scenarios excluding coal and excluding oil, which is great. Definitely, it's some of them are sort of utopian scenarios, but this is what civil society does. And then the government has to take them realistically and put them in their national planning. There is so much to be done on the African continent. For now, as civil society, we are restructuring ourselves to build a more connected structure. We want to link in the lead to COP22 and beyond COP21. We are working on linking together the sub-Saharan and North African countries, as well as the Euromed countries and the whole MENA region together. This is what we are doing now. And there's also a caravan that will be going through Africa from Senegal to Mauritania, I guess, to Morocco. I don't know the path, the route is yet to be determined, which is really good. And probably that's a bit for now.
Okay, very good. Mr. Mohamed Khalil, just to focus a little bit about Egypt. In the intended nationally determined contribution that Egypt delivered ahead of the COP, or during the COP, it indicated it would need $73 billion to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Can you tell us which are the priorities that have been outlined by Egypt in terms of both mitigation and adaptation?
Yes, thanks for the question. I'll tell you about that, but I need first to make a small comment on the issue of historical responsibility that was mentioned by Mariam. I think if I understood well, that what you outlined that in Paris Agreement we managed sort of to overcome historical responsibility, right? Yeah. And I don't want to put the negotiator's hat, but I mean, for the sake of the debate and argument, I know that sometimes there is really kind of political sensitivity around that, and frankly speaking, I don't understand why. We have this issue of historical responsibility. It's really something that belongs to the past. I'm seeing you smiling now, so I'm sure you're going to join the debate. And from my standing point, I see the matter of historical responsibility is not a rhetoric thing or just a political thing. It's a reality as well. I mean, to take the example of Egypt, let's give a practical example. I think many of you are aware of the threats that are facing the north coast of Egypt, especially the area of Sharm el-Sheikh and Kafr el-Sheikh and the surrounding area, because it's very low lying and there is the sea level rise. So this is something that I can see clearly historical responsibility in it. I think we saw today morning in the workshop that Egypt's contribution to global emission, it's 0.4 or 0.7, I don't recall the number, 0.6. So definitely this effect is not the effect of Egypt's contribution to global emission. It's the effect of historical responsibility. So it's a reality. And we shouldn't be kind of, skeptical about it or so careful. Let's not really approach this matter. It's a heated political debate. No, it's not.
But is it what we should be talking about now? I mean, like, we have to move over this historical responsibility. I think everybody in the world agrees that it's a reality. But now there's no time. Like, the African continent would need to leapfrog, won't it?
I'm not sure that I'm getting this right, and I'm gonna tell you why. because you need now to deal with the situation, right? The situation I was talking about in the North Coast, and how you're going to deal with it. You need to invest in addressing this. And the problem is that this investment is a diversion of development financing. I mean, you're going to cut from the finance that you need for hospitals, education, and so on, to deal with a problem that it's not yours. So unless the historical responsibility element is part of this debate, it's going to be really difficult to address such situations. So I mean, the whole point of what I wanted to make it that it's part of the reality. We shouldn't be dealing with it only as, I mean, a politically difficult issue for discussion. Now going back to your question, in the INDC submitted by Egypt, I believe you can all guess that there was strong emphasis on adaptation. And within the adaptation context, there is emphasis on the following priorities: management of water resources in a more efficient and sustainable manner, ensuring agricultural security, and protection of coastal zone, the examples that I was just mentioning now, and as well health, tourism, and cultural heritage. With regard to mitigation, the priorities are more or less on the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies and relying increasingly on renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Lena, I think you wanted to react on the part of historical responsibility.
Sorry. I just need to make two very quick comments on this. Just very quickly, I think like everyone recognizes that historical responsibility is one important element of determining what is a fair approach. But there's also other elements like who has the capacity now, where are the resources, for example, where is renewable energy easy to install. So I think this is one point that it's one element, but not the only one that determines what is fair or not. And the second one is, I think that the debate that focuses only on historical responsibility ignores that at least to many mitigation measures, there's very important co-benefits. So mitigation is not only something that hurts, but it's also something that brings so many co-benefits, for example, to health and social issues. That is actually, something, so we can actually move beyond this historical responsibility debate, as you said, I think. And I think Paris Agreement did a big step forward in this, without ignoring that it is something that you can take into account and need to take into account.
And I think that because of the differentiated responsibilities and the finance and technology flows that are associated with that, you can actually mobilize a lot of co-benefits. And here the case of renewable energy is an interesting case in point, because with the initiative that was presented at the beginning to install up to 10 gigawatt of additional renewable energy capacities on the African continent, that initiative was launched at the COP. And one important aim of the initiative, I guess, is also to get a large part of climate financing being addressed to support that initiative. But if you look at the expansion of renewable energy on the continent, you can say that the expansion of renewable energy here in Africa, it's not driven by climate change concerns. It's primarily driven by energy security concerns. In Africa, all over the continent, countries are confronted with a strongly rising energy demand and try to mobilize different sources of energy to actually satisfy this growing demand. And for fossil fuel importing countries on the African continent, and we have many of those here on the continent, getting less import dependent is also a really important driver for the development of renewable energy. And so here you can really exploit benefits that are coming from the climate community, from international negotiations, and also from commitments that developed countries but also emerging countries are taking to support sustainable development in different areas of the world to really also advance socio-economic development. So I think that's there are a lot of opportunities, particularly in that field.
Dr. Zibila, I just want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this. It seems that Africa is slated to become the last frontier for industrialization. We can expect a lot of projects like developing on the continent pretty rapidly. So how do we make sure that renewable energy's share in the energy mix is big enough that Africa just doesn't start emitting tons of emission? Like, how do we make sure that Africa's delayed development puts it in a good position to embrace new ideas and new technologies?
I think that creating the right political framework conditions is of key importance because in theory there's a lot of finance available that often does not find a project that is like bankable, that is like that they want to support. And I think that what, for example, Egypt did in the last years, that you implemented a feed-in tariff. That's a great step forward to push renewable energies, and because then investors have a certainty that if they invest in renewable energy, they can actually feed it into the grid and they will get a specific price on that. So that has been really important for Egypt, and that's an experience that you can also share with other African countries, because I think in all international corporations, I mean, in the past it used to be a lot of like north-south flows of technology, finance and knowledge as well. I mean, if somebody finances something, I mean, that person also has like the power to define certain priorities. I mean, it's not I mean, it's really attached also to power, right? And now it's changing into the direction that we have more like South-South cooperation as well. And I think that has a lot of potential, because then contexts are more similar, and you can like transfer your knowledge on the benefits, but also on the challenges of specific policy changes to other countries. But it's not enough to support renewable energy only, because we also need to address fossil fuels. Globally, there's the subsidy, I was looking for the right English word. Globally, fossil fuels get like 4 or 5 the amount of subsidies than renewable energies get. And that's often not known. I mean, often renewable energy get like accused that they consume a lot of subsidies, but if you look at the numbers, that's not true. Often they do not compete on an equal ground. And if you have fossil fuel subsidies, that's not only bad for renewable energy development, but also for the financial health of utilities. In many African countries, there's a real lack of investment in the energy sector, because the prices that the consumers pay, they do not cover the costs. And then, I mean, utilities are in a condition that they cannot invest into the future, and that applies to everything in the energy sector. And for energy security concerns, I mean, it's really important that you have a better financial situation of the utilities.
Thank you for this. Mariam, there is a lot of talk about how to provide universal electricity access in Africa. This is really an issue that concerns sub-Saharan Africa, obviously not Egypt or other Arab countries. But I would like to know how different grassroots organizations and NGOs are tackling specifically this, trying to make governments or policymakers understand that maybe decentralized small scale off-grid solutions would provide electrification at a much faster pace than massive energy plants would. Do you work on this at all, or do you know of NGOs who do?
Yes, absolutely. On the African level, on a continental level, and as well as an Egyptian level. Civil society is doing so much work on that when it comes to policy, when it comes to awareness building, to raising awareness, when it comes to consultancy, and in the end, the technical capability. I'm not a really technical person, but because I'm part of the civil society. Let me give an example of Egypt. I've just mentioned this just a while ago. Again, the 7-pathway publication by the civil society that gives 7 energy scenarios to Egypt, where we could exclude coal and where we could exclude nuclear. It gives the costs, it gives the opportunities, it gives the implementers, the import and export. It's very comprehensive. It's a very comprehensive guide for the government. Definitely civil society is not the one that takes action. We can help amending laws. We can help with new design of laws that incentivize renewable energies, safe and clean renewable energies. The policy design in Egypt is actually moving forwards. We now have 3 schemes for the feed-in tariff for solar and wind. There's also a waste-to-energy tariff coming up, which is great. There's a subsidy reform, fossil fuel subsidy reform, which was a 5-year target, now extended to 8-year target, probably to ensure some social measures, social equity measures. Let's hope it's good. But for us as civil society, it's very saddening to see that by 2030, in the Egypt 2030 development agenda, the share of coal in the, well, it hasn't been decided in the primary energy mix. However, it has been decided in the electricity mix. And it really makes us wonder, and it makes us amazed, how come we couldn't decide numbers in our INDCs, any specific numbers? We couldn't define any specific numbers in several things, climate-related, mitigation, adaptation-related. But we could actually put a number for 29% of coal in our electricity generation energy mix. It's good it will be balanced by sort of 40-something% renewable energy. However, this includes nuclear, which for us as civil society, we really have wide concerns over that. The fact that we are sort of, I don't know what to call it, but we are like looking back to the future. Like we are developing in ways where we have seen examples in real life going on. We are quite concerned because we are probably in Africa and in Egypt, we are not the ones, like the African emissions are like around 4% of global emissions, something like this. They're not even 5%, but we are the ones who will be hit hardest. So we cannot expect someone coming and taking our hands and saying, okay, you need to take a different path for your own existence. Although if we look at it from an economic perspective, the developed nations, and let's go back to this North-South division now, they have investments in the it's a very resourceful continent, and what they take from the continent is actually more than Africans do take. Like when it comes to investments, when it comes to resources, brain drain, it's all there. So what we have to do is that we have to be very progressive in our policy design, in our environmental standards. We have to acknowledge that we lack capacity, probably when it comes to project design and implementation. We lack sort of solid planning capacities. We have to acknowledge this now within the framework of the Paris agreements and all the numerous papers and reports and trainings that the civil society is offering, be it continental, national, international civil society. There are things if we want to do. The thing is we need to take it seriously now. We need to move because the very existence of the people in the African continent is actually threatened. And let's see local people, let's see, I'm personally Alexandrian, and I can see every year what's happening in Alexandria by the coast. Like so many people lose their very small businesses. Those people are not capitalists. They are looking for their mere living costs or breadwinning. This is really saddening. And we are now pushing for adaptation to be mainstreamed in all the national strategies in Egypt and in Africa. Unfortunately, in the 2030 vision in Egypt, which has been already put, there hasn't been that urgency highlighted in our plans, which is very saddening. It's very interesting to see that in a country like Cameroon, and you can imagine the economy of Cameroon, how it is. There is one parliamentarian who is known to be like the climate risk man who goes on lobbies for adaptation measures to be taken into the national budget planning, which is really good. I think we have much to work on when it comes to awareness building, to awareness, to raising awareness actually, and informing those who are in charge, civil society is very much willing to do that, be it on technical basis, on a policy basis, negotiations, everything, we are there. And speaking of the centers of knowledge in Africa, there are a couple of them, definitely. There's the African Climate Policy Center. It's a very well-established center with senior policy experts that actually advise governments of several African countries. They also are part, or let me now speak about the ClimeDev platform. The ClimeDev platform is a platform for innovation in Africa. It's sponsored by many like development funds, but it's basically under the African Union Commission and the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa and the African Development Bank, which is actually doing lots of work on climate change mitigation and adaptation in the continent. This platform, it holds like an annual conference where you can go and you find experts from every field you can think of doing so much research on the continent, providing models, be it on agriculture, on water, or everything. So everything is there. We just, if we want to act, we need to act because we don't have options.
Excellent. I have a question that I'm going to open, like whoever wants to answer it, or maybe more than one people can do it. During the COP, but also like more recently, there's been a lot of talks about the role of cities to spearhead like sustainable development. And there's actually a report that was released last week called the African Economic Outlook, produced by the OECD and other people. And basically they calculated that by mid-century, 2 out of 3 Africans will be living in a city. So roles of city are becoming even more important. So how do you think cities can be climate resilient and can propose a sustainable pathway and like actually protect their inhabitants from climate change risks?
You can add on later. Yeah, I think cities are quite interesting. As you mentioned, many people will live in cities in the future, and so it's an important area to focus on if we want to see how our population is going to live in the future. And I think also cities are very interesting to look at because they are kind of laboratories, and many cities around the world have been, for example, around I think it was at the COP now that around 1,000 cities have pledged that they would shift to renewable energies by 2050. So they're moving at a much faster pace than many of their governments are actually doing. So I think there is the chance that they are kind of role models for how the entire country could look like later. So I think this is quite an important movement to support, and also because at the local level, if you look at cities and think about how the city could look in the future, it's also much more easy to identify the co-benefits of the actions that you can take on climate change. So if you rethink like how do we want to live in this specific city, it could be a small city, big city, it becomes much more easy to actually involve all the citizens to understand what their priorities are, how would they define a good life, a good lifestyle for the future. So there's a lot of opportunities in there. So I think it's really important to push cities and to support cities in taking these ideas forward.
It's interesting. Yeah, sorry, please. Go ahead.
Just to add, I fully agree with what you said, and I believe that cities are also important centers of innovation, and many cities around the world face quite similar problems. For example, if you take a mega city like Cairo, which is quite similar to other mega cities in emerging economies, you have a huge challenge in the transport sector, right? I mean, a lot of people spend a lot of time in the traffic jam. And you do not only spend a lot of time there, but it's also like you have a lot of emissions, you have a lot of air pollution, and that's not only a challenge that Cairo is facing. I mean, if you go to a city like Sao Paulo, they've quite the similar challenge. So, for example, shifting the transport sector, that I think there we can have really important impulses coming from cities and like moving away maybe from the private transportation which is based on cars but also to invest more in public transportation. Then I think when we talk about emissions from the energy sector, we have a tendency to solely talk about the electricity sector. But we need to tackle emissions that are coming from the transport sector as well. And that's also a huge challenge in Germany, for example. I mean, we talk about the German energy transition, but we really focus on the electricity sector. And in my opinion, we don't have a credible solution for the transport sector so far. So I think this is an area where we really need innovation coming from cities.
I'm just interrupting the conversation for a second to tell you it's time to actually write down your questions. Thank you. Just a piece of information I came across, which I thought was quite interesting in that report that was focusing on cities, is that they have calculation that once a city reach like the threshold of 6 million inhabitants, the GDP per capita falls down. So that's kind of interesting, and so there's a lot of work to be done. But can you give just one example of a city that is an example of like going on that sustainable path, and what type of, who are the actors and who communicates together to actually make the city great for its inhabitants, but also efficient and clean? Is there one that comes to mind particularly? Maybe, yes, Mr. Khalil?
I think I saw a presentation about one in South Korea. And the presentation was about the activities of the International Green Growth Institute, the Global Green Growth Institute in South Korea, which is really doing a lot of interesting and good work. And the presentation was explaining that how a particular city, I don't recall the name because, South Korean is very difficult, so I can't capture the name. They were explaining in the presentation how they managed to restore all the ecosystem pre the industrial and urban activity in the city. There was even like a stream that has dried out, and they managed to restore it back again. I don't have really much to add to this issue, to the previous.
Can you talk to us about how sustainable Cairo is? Or Alexandria, for that matter. You might be a good person to talk about this.
There are two approaches. The problem with this kind of I'm not really expert on the matter. It's more a view of an observer. The problem with this kind of mega city thing is really where to start from. And this is a problem that happens and there are the two approaches. Whether you invest in the existing infrastructure, rehabilitating all this, or you move to a new territory, a new design, and so on. And it seems that the government here, it's more of the view that it's better to move to a new one, which is the new administrative capital, or what's so-called, so that it would be designed according to sustainable development norms and criteria, which can depend on renewable energy. It would have a modern transport system.
Energy efficient building and so forth.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. The quality of air and water will be monitored. And I think by that, the idea is to reduce pressure on, the capital is historical capital. And with that, maybe it can give an opportunity or room to improve it, but maybe in a more gradual basis. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, keep the mic, and I just want to backtrack a little bit to the negotiations again, to the COP. Because during the COP in Paris, the African Renewable Energy Initiative was launched. So could you give us an outline of what this initiative wants to achieve? Explain in what way it differs from the 20 other renewable energy initiatives that already exist in Africa, and how much focus is given to off-grid, small-scale, decentralized systems?
Sure. The African Renewable Energy Initiative had twofold kind of main objectives. The first one maybe is of political nature, which is to show how Africa is serious with regard to addressing climate change. I think it came across frequently during the discussions that Africa is really the least contributing to the global emissions. However, it is the most impacted as well and most vulnerable. And the underlying political message that we wanted to give, that despite this reality, this didn't prevent Africa from coming forward and putting its plan and contributing as well to reducing emissions through working, or depending more on renewable energy. The assessment is that, of course, the continent is underdeveloped and it will go through a massive phase of development. So it is important that the main source of energy would be renewable one instead of conventional one, so that this doesn't lead to increase in emissions. The other main objective is to address the access gap. There is a huge access gap in Africa with regard to
600 million people.
Yeah, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And the objective of the initiative is really to address this gap. It is different than many other initiatives in many ways. First of all, this is the only African-owned, African-led initiative. It was developed only by Africans. It's not an external initiative that is being proposed by other countries or institutions. And also, as we were discussing in the morning during the workshop, we don't want this initiative to be just another initiative. We want it to really have a real impact on people and populations, especially the most vulnerable and most remote area as well, and most remote people, by trying to promote off-grid systems and distributing systems, so that the real success of this initiative is for people who never had electricity before. This initiative would make the difference for them and would manage to make them have access to electricity. That's the real success of it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just one addition on the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. We also had that discussion during the morning. One important goal stated by the initiative is to add 10 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity. So that's like the specific goal. And there's a certain tension, trade-off, maybe contradiction between that declared goal and the goal to create access to energy. Because, I mean, if you want to add up these capacities, that would be like an increase of 1/3 of the existing capacities within the next 5 years. So it's a really short period of time. And if you want to get to that number, then the way is maybe not to go through small off-grid solutions, because, I mean, the poor people, they consume little amounts of energy. And you won't get up to that big number. So I think to make clear that energy access is also a quite important goal, maybe it would make sense to include an energy access goal as well, and to say, okay, X number of people should be supplied by renewable energy, which did not have energy access before. Yeah, so I think there's a certain kind of contradiction.
I want to just move on a little bit because we don't have tons of time. But before I go to the questions of the public, I just wanted to have a quick look with you at what your thoughts were related to COP22 in Marrakesh that's going to happen this year. So Mariam first. I would like to know, how are civil society groups and NGOs organizing to create a momentum around the COP22 in Marrakesh, specifically because it's happening on the continent? So what are you trying to get out of it, and how do you create excitement and momentum around it?
So first of all, we want everyone to acknowledge where Africa is now and the condition of Africa now. Africa is in extreme energy poverty. Africa is a very water scarce. It's becoming actually a very water scarce continent. And looking at the different modes of generating energy, we can find that there's a huge relation between energy and water. So this is something that all the African countries have to take into consideration. In the meantime, we are really working on a very interesting contradiction. When you address renewable energy and energy access, when you address renewable energy as means of eradicating energy poverty and energy access, it's super cool. But when you address renewable energy as mitigation, well, no, we don't have to mitigate, sorry, we didn't cause it. So we are trying to work a little bit on this, addressing it. How do we address this mode of development? So this is very challenging for the civil society, actually, to overcome our water scarcity, our energy poverty. Well, the state of the continent when it comes to conflict over resources, when it comes to lives that are being lost, that Africa is on the front line of all impacts of climate change. This is very challenging for us as civil society. So we are trying a little bit to get flexible with the approaches of the government, which means is that we are also trying to push for governments to adopt innovative solutions to their existing energy infrastructure. For example, for countries that are planning to do coal, we are definitely completely against it. But at least let's think of where the technology has gone when it comes to retrofitting, to carbon capture and storage and all of this. Like, this is our worst case scenario as civil society, but at least to acknowledge that this exists. As I've mentioned before, that we are trying to bring together the North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and all of this together, because the rhetorics are completely different when it comes to negotiations and approaches and natures of those countries. We really hope to be given a chance, especially in North Africa and the Middle East, to be able to contribute to our negotiating skills, or how we can seize the opportunity. Now, the Paris Agreement acknowledges loss and damage. There is a Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage, which is acknowledged in the treaty. Loss and damage is very critical on how we can prove it, all right? But now we have to seize the opportunity and know how to address it. We all want to work on this together. Civil society has less sensitivity in getting information and talking to this and this and this and that. This kind of diplomacy thing that probably it's so hard for a negotiator to speak out something really harsh. Civil society can. So let us help. We are really connected and really interlinked, and sometimes we know how to say the bad stuff. And at the same time, we know when to back. So we are not here for pointing fingers. Even the new structure of the Paris Agreement is not about pointing fingers. It's about pointing out what's missing and where, and who's missing what, and how can we help out. So now we have this loss and damage mechanism, we have this capacity building mechanism we hope we can contribute with. We are doing our structure, we are setting our priorities. And last but not least, on cities. Let me not speak about megacities, but this was a really bright example that I want to see. If we take a look at the Red Governorate, HEPCA, the Hurghada Environmental Protection and Conservation Agency, which is a non-government organization. Go there and look what HEPCA is doing. HEPCA are great. So basically, they do public hearings, they get the community of fishermen, they get to the local community, they tell them what exactly is happening there, they tell them what is happening on the ground, what do these policies mean, how do they translate government policies and everything, what does energy, the new energy investment trend or the energy plans lead, what does coal mean, what does renewable energy mean. They have waste collection points. They communicate directly with the community. They have very close links with the government, the Red Sea Governorate, and the Minister of Environment. They take things to the court. They are very powerful. And why? Because they include people. Because this treaty is about people. So we cannot really bet on people's survival for political considerations. And this is what we as civil society are trying to do. We are trying to find spots to speak and present our work in each and every coming. We have like a plan for all the coming conventions. We're trying to take stock of all the negotiations, because this treaty does not operate all alone. We have to look at the Montreal Treaty, we have to look at the trade and taxation and the carbon footprint and the carbon markets, and mentioning South Korea has been doing so bad when it comes to the INDCs. Their INDC submissions are so bad. I'm very sorry for South Korea. But anyway, we are doing much work on that. We are trying to be of use. So I hope our efforts do pile up into something useful.
Okay. Lina, you are an expert in environmental law. So COP22 in Marrakesh in Morocco has been dubbed as the COP of action, the COP of implementation. What can we expect is going to happen? What will be the outcomes? Why is it called action implementation right after Paris?
Let me outline a bit on the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement does set the broad objectives that we want to achieve over the next decades, and it sets out obligations for countries, but these obligations are often phrased very vaguely, and they lack details. And there are lots of mechanisms that have been established in general rules. There has been a transparency scheme that has been established, but no one really knows how it will operate. There's a capacity committee that established, no one knows how it operates. There's a general stock take every 5 years, but we don't know much more about it, like what are the inputs into the stock take, how it's going to look like, what are the outcomes of it. We know that like every country needs to regularly submit its INDC, its like national climate plan, but we don't know how these climate plans should actually look like, whether there should be some common features, how the accounting should happen on whether these INDCs are actually being implemented. So there's so many details that have not been agreed in Paris because they were too contentious, or because there was a lack of time, and so there's so much outstanding issues that need to be tackled in the coming years, and Marrakesh is the first step to actually, we had some international discussions now in Bonn over the last weeks, but Marrakesh is going to be the first COP where first decisions are going to be taken, and I think especially issues like capacity building and finance and technology transfer do require a lot of attention now that we try to get actually countries to implement the INDCs that they have promised they would implement. And I think it's really important now for everyone to stay on their toes, to actually watch the governments and see whether they will keep up the spirit of Paris, l'esprit de Paris, like they've always been saying. So there was so much media attention focused on Paris, but now media is walking away a bit, and it doesn't seem that interesting anymore, and the heads of government are walking away a bit, and it doesn't seem that interesting anymore, the topic. So now that we agree on the details, there's lots of risk that we water down this spirit of Paris, and that in the details, devil lies in the details as always, there's the risk that we create a lot of loopholes if we don't watch carefully. So I think this is very important, Marrakesh does the first step on it. And I think with a broader outlook of what comes beyond, it requires getting all actors on board really on this mission to implement Paris and to tackle climate change. So it's not only Ministry of Environment that need to look at it, this is also other ministries, Ministry of Finance, of Energy, of Economy, Agriculture, everyone. It's civil society, it's a business, it's investors. So if we don't act all together, we won't get to 2 degree or 1.5 degree. And this requires a really broad societal discussion actually, because it's a radical shift of the economies that we need. It's not only moving away from certain energy sources, but it's also asking ourselves, how do we define wealth? How do we want to live in the future? What do we want to eat? Do we want to fly all the time? How do we want to use transport? Which industries do we want to have in our country? It doesn't always need to be the most, the one that creates most revenues, but is actually the most polluting one. So all these questions need to be asked now, and this requires getting everyone on board and involving everyone. So I think it's a big mission that we have now, and let's hope that it doesn't get lost in Marrakesh, but that we can keep the good spirit from Paris.
So now I'm going to ask, I have some questions of the public, and they're very interesting. There's one I would like to direct to you, Mr. Khalil. Someone asked, if cities have a role to play in climate mitigation, does Egypt provide enough autonomy to municipal governments to take such action?
As I said, I'm really not the expert on the matter, so again, I'll give more view of an observer. Well, the question, of course, it depends on the administrative and political system existing. I think it's obvious, and I believe whereas the current constitution introduced um, relatively some measures for decentralization, but definitely the question would be how to operationalize that. And in order to operationalize that, it's going to be through the laws, which did not happen yet. So my conclusion was that the status quo remain until there are laws that would operationalize what has been introduced in the Constitution. The question now would be, is there really a correlation between this and that city gets more sustainable? I'm not sure about that, frankly speaking. I didn't go through enough literature to draw a conclusion in this regard, whether really this is a determinant factor if decentralization would lead to more sustainable cities or not. I mean, from top of my head, I don't think there is really evidence for correlation. I think it depends on the policies. Otherwise, those countries who have some sort of central planning will never move to sustainable path. And I don't think that this would be true or would make sense. Maybe definitely, it can help, but I don't think really it's kind of determinant factor. At the end of the day, it depends on how the ministries and public administration as a whole are organized, are working together as one team, are setting the right policies, regardless whether it is centralized way of administration or decentralized way.
Mariam, would you like to
I would
react?
definitely love to add to this. I would love to add to this. I've only been living in Cairo for like 6 or 7 years, but like let me bring on my love of Alexandria here and what I'm seeing now and how has that changed actually over years, and try to reflect on the policies and the sort of managing the city or whatever it is, you name it. So we need to operationalize. I've always had this problem with the operationalize word, but we actually need to operationalize all of what exists. If we look at the structure in the government, we find that there is this counselor for I don't know what, this counselor for people, this counselor for youth, المجلس المحلي مش عارفة الإيه, sorry to speak, it's the same. But the thing is it effective? Is it even effective? Does it bring the right people in? That's the question. If we give the power to the people to know if people are first of all informed, and then they are given a chance to participate. I don't say participate, come and like putting away the parliament. Let's speak on a governmental level. It's as simple as that. If we bring civil society, if we bring like the fishermen, if we bring all of the local community, some people from Alexandria University or the academia, if we bring a couple of private sector companies, we sit together on a table. It only needs like 10 people, I'm not joking, to define where Alexandria need to go, all right? So what we see now definitely indicates that it's either the people in charge have absolutely no idea what Alexandria needs, all right? Or they know, but they are not the ones who decide. Or they know and they are not the ones who decide, and there is no finance. Or there is finance, but we don't know who benefits from inaction, all right? Or putting them in different areas than they need to be. Like for example, in Alexandria, we did not need news, like, what do I call it? It's not even the sidewalk, it's the edge of the sidewalk. We had other priorities other than renewing the very strong sidewalks, all right? You get it? So now we need to give power to the people, and this is what civil society is doing. Let me take the example of the Red Sea Governorate. It's dear to my heart. Inform people, this is what civil society is doing. Mobilize people, mobilize resources, get them think together from all sects of society. And then we can talk to the one in charge. If people don't know their rights and they don't know who to talk to, progress will not happen, definitely. So if we get them informed, and then if we work together, not pointing fingers again, but if we work on informing and capacity building together with those who are in charge, we are definitely going places. It is that simple. But people who don't have access to information regarding the resources, the priorities maybe. They do not set their own priorities, someone else does. So how will they ever take action? So in the end, power is for the people, and power comes out of the people, and change comes from the people. That's why all of the society, parliamentarians, government, people, academia, they all need to work together to make this happen, and to actually go forwards with a low carbon economy or a sustainable development or whatsoever you want to call it.
I have another question related to climate finance here. Someone wrote, the 100 billion Green Climate Fund money seems to be a cause for optimism. However, is there information on how this money will be distributed? And I would like to just add on this. I hope the person who has that question is not going to be upset. Just what type of mechanisms do we have to monitor that the money that is going to be dispersed is actually going to the project that we gave it to? Anyone? Can be anyone.
I think this is an important question. Maybe this is something that we didn't touch upon sufficiently during the debate. It also relates to the issue if, the money is there at all. And this has been really a big part of the debate and on the ongoing negotiations. As you know, during the Paris negotiations, there was the idea that has been put forward by developing countries to have some sort of roadmap. So at least, if there are no specific or concrete engagements with regard to the amounts that should be reached, we need to have some sort of roadmap for sake of predictability and transparency. But developed countries objected to that. So this is one reason why we are in the dark. And I think this is going to be, as we are speaking about COP22 as an implementation COP, I think this is going to be an important part of the discussions that will take place in COP22. With regard to monitoring, my understanding is that the GCF develop quite rigorous criteria with regard to selection of project and a monitoring system to make sure that the projects are matching the criteria that have been set. And I think the criteria in large should address how it is contributing to emission reduction and how it is contributing to achieving sustainable development, if I'm recalling well. I don't recall all of them by those that come to my mind. Anyone would like to?
Yeah, just maybe to clarify, because I think there's often a misunderstanding of this 100 billion number. So this 100 billion is public and private money, and it's not all going through the GCF, not all going through the Green Climate Fund. So there's different channels which can be used, and this includes also bilateral funding. It includes different funds, also like the adaptation fund. And so just to clarify, because this 100 billion is often a bit like mispresented, without judging whether it's good or not, and just clarifying. So there's different funds, of course, that already exist, like the adaptation fund, the least developed country fund, the Green Climate Fund, which is the new big fund that has been launched in Cancun. On the Green Climate Fund, there is one specific issue. Maybe this is also related to the question whether the money actually gets to the projects, because there was lots of criticism before that the funds that were used to channel climate finance were often going through multilateral development banks, and there was the criticism that much of the money got lost on the way in all these going through all these different institutions, and then it was like not very country driven where this money would go to in the end, because it was the multilateral development banks in the end who would decide which projects would get it, and then it was often external project managers, so it wasn't building the capacity in the country. So the Green Climate Fund now has, like the Adaptation Fund has already done it, like this direct access provision, which means that national entities can directly access the money from the fund, so it doesn't necessarily need to go through the multilateral development banks. And this is supposed to increase the capacity in country, to make it more country-driven, so that the country decides more what the priorities are. And yeah, so we need to see whether in operationalizing it really works out, but this is the general idea behind it.
Yes, of course.
Yes, because I've been in touch with the GCF, yes, very shortly. I've been in touch with the GCF procedure once. Definitely the GCF has some like 30 documents on how to get funding and stuff. And also funding goes both ways. Like it just doesn't just come from the GCF or from the accredited entities to the country, but also if you have done some feasibility study or if you have a project on mind that you have worked on it, you can submit it through your Ministry of International Cooperation, like your government, to the GCF, and then it goes to any of the development banks or any funding entity that can do that. And regarding Egypt, we actually have what is called a National Priority Committee, which has stakeholders, or basically it has ministers from concerned ministries regarding, I mean, it's a National Priority Committee for a several range of projects, not just for climate change. But what's very interesting is that, for example, if any, what can I say, any like ministry or any governorate wants to access funds, for example, for the GCF, it has to first pass by, or if any actually donor wants to come and pour money or give you a soft loan for a certain project, it has to pass first by this National Priority Committee, where the donor or whoever initiates this project has to deal with the concerned ministry, where the minister gives a presentation in front of all the other ministries. So now we know where the loan is coming and like what is the degree of priority. And at this point, out of experience, we need to highlight the urgency of climate change projects. That's it.
So I'm going to offer you just a fun exercise to finish with. I have a tricky question and I would like you all to answer in a minute if possible. Is it possible, and how can we turn around the narrative around sustainable development and make it an opportunity rather than a break to development?
They start.
You start.
Finished. I just finished. Give me time to think.
I didn't get the question, please.
How can we change the narrative about how most people look at sustainable development? Like if you talk to heads of governments, they would see sustainable development policies as a break to their development. So how do we manage to like change that narrative and put sustainable development as an opportunity actually for development? Short, 1 minute. One sentence if possible.
We'll put the stopwatch. I don't share really the view behind the question. I don't think that this is a kind of a commonly shared view that it is being perceived as a hindrance or an obstacle to achieve sustainable development. And frankly speaking, I mean, I work on diplomacy for a long time. My business is really going into speeches and preparing speeches. I don't recall that I came across any statement that qualifies sustainable development this way. As we were discussing before the seminar here, before the discussion, the problem with sustainable development is not whether it is a positive thing or a negative thing. Definitely it is a positive thing. The problem is how to manage the trade-offs, because there is always trade-offs between the economic, social, and environmental aspects. And that's why we say that the challenge really in achieving sustainable development, it's easier said than done. But the challenge is how to manage the trade-offs so that you can manage really to achieve the three aspects together. And that's why it is always advised that sustainable development is based on integrated approach. This is how you can manage to the different trade-offs by linking the dots and pursuing an integrated approach. And this would be my reply to the question. That's how you can really make an opportunity out of it to make sure that it is being pursued and followed in an integrated way.
Thank you. Dr. Zibila.
I also agree that sustainable development cannot be seen as an obstacle at all. I mean, it was actually a major step forward when the United Nations came out with that concept, because they achieved to bridge the development community, development concerns of developing countries with environmental protection concerns of other countries. And now we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also quite revolutionary in the UN context, because in the past we had Millennium Development Goals that focused on developing countries only, and now we have Sustainable Development Goals that have a global reach. They do not apply only to developing countries, but they apply to every country of the world, and I can tell you that these global goals already have quite an impact on the German Sustainable Development Strategy, because now our government realigns our sustainable development priorities with these global goals. And I think that sustainable development is a lot of managing trade-offs, but also about creating synergies. And my major criticism with sustainable development as a concept would be that it may mean anything or everything or nothing, because I mean everybody can interpret it in a different way.
Yeah, I actually like the question. I think it brings up quite an interesting social dimension to the debate we had, and maybe we can rephrase the question. I think it was maybe more focused on, because we had the debate before that renewable energy was presented. Sometimes when you say like it's a mitigation measure, then no one wants to accept it. But if you say it's an energy security issue, then it's fine. So maybe it was more going in this direction. I think it's important to ask how we can rephrase the debate around it, and that's also what you mentioned. That what is your aim as civil society, no? So I think what the challenge is that if we change the debate, or if we actually move to a more sustainable world with low emission development, there will be losers, and those losers are those that are strong in the current system. So, it's quite a challenging task. So I think actually bringing normal people together and experimenting and showing that other ways of living and of interacting and of social interaction and of creating wealth, and not only in the sense of economic growth, but wealth of well-being, is the way forward to show that a different model is possible and also feasible and achievable, and that is something that we should pursue. So I think actually experimenting is the best way of changing the debate.
Maria?
Yeah. So let me put it as a scene. So it's basically not panicking when we hear the word sustainable development, because sometimes it just rings a bell. Oh my God, I have to do a whole transformation of my economy. No, I can't do that. But the thing is, if we stop for a while and instead of looking outside at oh my God, what can I get? I need this transfer of technology. I need this finance. Okay, hold on for a second and just look around. Look at what you have. Look at the research. Look at the models. Look at Carm Solar. Look at Tiba Solar. Look at all of these who do manufacture things, because sustainable development, definitely sustainable energy, and all of this is a small example. But look at what you have. Mobilize the resources that you have internally. So basically, to reach somewhere, you have to assess where you are, what resources you have, including people, including knowledge, and then we know where we want to be. So I think we really need this looking around and assessing what we have, setting priorities in coordination, not separate priorities, but then where are we headed? That's the thing. So let's see where we are, to know where we want to go, and then to start to make sense to ourselves first before making sense to anyone else.
Well, that's a beautiful way to wrap it up, I think. I would like to thank all of my panelists for trying to break the mics of the DAD. Thank you so much, all of you. I think it was a very interesting conversation. I had a lot of fun. I hope you too. Thank you for attending this event and for your questions. And now we're going to have some nice food and we can all chat in the garden. Thank you.